Hi, I'm Elizabeth Whelan, an artist on Chappaquiddick Island, part of the island of Martha's Vineyard, floating off the coast of Massachusetts. And we're here in my studio today. I'm going to show you some examples of portrait work I've done and talk a little bit about my portrait process. So let's get started. Here's my full layout of colors for my palette. I don't always do this, but when I'm working on a portrait, I find it really useful to mix up a bunch of the colors that I see in a person's skin tones in advance. And that way, when I'm working, I don't have to spend a lot of time mixing things up as I go. I have a full range of brushes, synthetic and natural bristles, and medium and mineral spirits. I like to use odorless mineral spirits as a thinner. So when I go to meet a client, if someone has commissioned me, what I usually do is spend some time with them talking and chatting and getting to know them, also taking lots and lots of photographs and doing some sketches, sometimes pencil sketches, sometimes I'll be working in oil, and then I'll go back with all that reference material to my studio and do a more finished drawing like the one that you see here, and also usually some color studies so that the client can see what my idea is for the painting. I do like to paint from life, and if I can have the opportunity to have someone either come to my studio or I come to them, I really do enjoy doing that. I do find in our modern day we're a little bit rushed, and trying to get 60 hours out of somebody to sit consecutively for a portrait is difficult. And there are also some types of portraits that really you can do a much better job by getting photo reference, such as children, for example, or anybody who's doing an activity that's moving quickly. It's often hard to get someone to pose for a long time. So this is the kind of color study I'm talking about. A little small painting. These are about 9 by 12, and these were two studies I did for a diptych, which is basically a pair of paintings. In this case, I wanted the eventual portrait to act sort of as one big scene when you put the two paintings together, but also so that the individual paintings could work by themselves. And in this particular case, these are two sisters, and so I did these small color studies to send to their parents. Now, one of the things that I would note about something like this is that obviously you see I don't put the facial characteristics in, and that's because I really want to only paint that face the one time. It's really difficult to make it look exactly the same at just a couple of inches high as well as the full-size portrait, and I'd rather put all the energy into the final piece. So here you can see how I use the color study. I send them off to the client, and they can look at them and tell me if they have any changes. You know, sometimes somebody wants something different in the background or different color clothing, that kind of thing. And then they return them to me, and I use them as part of the process when I'm actually painting. So these are those same paintings in process. And you can see how the color study really does inform what I end up doing as I work along. And this is how the final painting turned out. I was really happy with the result. The girls look as if they're enjoying themselves. The crafts are very colorful, but they don't detract from the people and the faces. And also, one of the girls was 8 years old and the other 11 when I was working on this painting. And so we put the hands of the clock to reflect those two ages in the background. Kind of a little touch that they'll know about in years to come. When I'm actually painting a portrait, I start with usually toning the canvas with some sort of color, and often a cool color, because that will contrast nicely with the portrait skin tones. And then I will draw, usually in pencil, sometimes by gridding up, or sometimes just roughly, from the reference material, um, the layout that I'm looking for. And I can at this time decide some of the complexity or lack of thereof that I'd like to have in the painting. I do a first pass underpainting with raw umber, which is a kind of a neutral brown color, a little bit gray brown, and that serves as a starting point for me to determine where the contrast in the painting will be, and try to get the accuracy of the likeness and the details. And from that, I'll go to a second pass where I define things a lot more clearly. I will make the hands, for example, and features such as the ear far more accurate. And this really gives me a good starting point for laying in the color. And here's the finished painting in this case, a portrait of Nat Benjamin, who's a local boat builder and boat designer on the island of Martha's Vineyard and quite well known. I really liked the way the light came in on the side of his face. I have a detail here of that. And you can see how that really helped develop the form of his head. It contrasts nicely with the dark area behind him. I also painted his business partner, Ross Gannon, and I'm showing Ross here in his boat out sailing I imagine, in the Vineyard Sound. But when I took the reference material, we were actually in the harbor, not sailing, and I had forgotten to take my camera with me, so we used a flip phone that Ross had to take some very grainy small pictures. But this is exactly what I love about portraiture. A great deal of portraiture does not depend on photography. It depends on my imagination and creating a scene that looks realistic from the materials I have. I don't like to, although I use photo reference, I don't like to be limited by it in any way. And I love that expression on Ross's face. He looks very much as if he's enjoying a day of sailing. And you can see here how the light on the one side of his face really helps create the sense of dimension. For this large portrait of Stina Sayer, who is a fashion designer in Vineyard Haven, I decided to work instead of on a cool background, on a very warm background. There were going to be cool tones from the walls and from the light coming in from the shop window at the very beginning, the front of her workshop. And I wanted to make sure that there was some nice contrast there by having a warmer color underneath. In order to make sure that I was able to put the cooler tones where I wanted them, instead of waiting till later in the process, as I might do in another type of painting where I add the highlights later. In this case, I wanted to make sure I pulled in all those light forms quite early on and really got the feeling of where the light would hit the garments, where it would hit the fabric that was rolled out on the floor, and how that would also look in the mirror behind her. Here's the work in process, and you can see that I'm putting in lots of different types of white and some pale yellows and pale blues as well. And here's the finished piece. It's 60 inches high by 40 inches wide, so it's quite tall. I love the repeating forms of Stina and her mannequin and, of course, the reflection in the mirror. And also all the various shades of white and that feeling of brightness. The way that the yellow gold color underneath comes through really helped. Now, for a larger family study, it can be difficult to get everyone together and posed, so to speak. Thank goodness for portrait painting. You don't need to have everybody posed exactly with the correct expression at the correct moment or anything of the sort. In fact, I like things to be a lot more freeform. So I came to visit this family. Not all the family members could be present at the same time. And they just sat and chatted and interacted on their porch. And I took a whole bunch of photos. And then on subsequent days, other family members who hadn't been here at the time were able to come in, and we sort of recreated a part of the pose. So I knew kind of where I'd like them to be. And it was quite fun. This is where my background as an illustrator comes into play. I have been painting for portraits for about 10 years, but before that I was a graphic designer and illustrator. And being able to draw from my imagination or create scenes that aren't actually there has proven to be very useful in the portrait painting. And sometimes I'll do preliminary sketches like this one. I didn't use this pose in the final painting, but I really liked this. And as I was getting started on the painting, because I had all these separate scenes and now I had to put them all together, I had done the color study. And then as I worked first pass, second pass on the painting itself, I made sure that I was really unifying the scene so that it looked as if everybody had been there at one time. And here I am continuing to paint on this large painting. And this one was also 40 by 60, so very big painting. And I just worked across it kind of like a typewriter, going from one side to the other to keep the consistency to the painting as I worked on the whole thing. And the finished piece. I love the way those umbrellas created the architectural feeling of sort of security and safety, and also their reflections in the glass behind. Likewise, the repeating pattern of the base of the chairs, I think that worked really well. And you can see just a little bit over the fellow on the far right's shoulder, reflections of the boat. And there are a few more if you were in closer to the painting that you'd be able to see, so that one gets the feeling of the scene being at the edge of the water without necessarily having to show the water directly. In order to paint local author and Pulitzer Prize winning author Geraldine Brooks, I didn't want to do a traditional scene of her with a pile of books and paper looking studious. And I really thought this one turned out very nicely in the sense that it showed a tender moment between her and her horse, a different side of Geraldine, but a good way to show someone. I really like to find activities people love to do, or things that they are surrounded with that have meaning to them. It just makes for a more personal painting. Here we have a portrait of Dale McClure, who used to be the president of the Agricultural Society of Martha's Vineyard. And this is one of his tractors, and he was partially responsible for the building behind him being built. So that had a lot of meaning. I told him just to turn up in whatever clothes that he had, that he was comfortable in, and he wore two check shirts. So that was quite challenging to paint, but a very lovely fellow. And a funny little story that goes along with this. The green shirt did have a tear in it, and he told me that his wife had said that he needed to change his shirt before he left, and he told her that I would just paint it out, which I did. And this is why I tell people all the time that oil paint is the original Photoshop. Another one of our well-known authors is Cynthia Riggs, and she writes really great mystery stories that are based on Martha's Vineyard. So I thought it was nice to show her in her garden. She has a wonderful garden, and she really loves being out there messing around in it. And I thought that showed another side of her, as well as her writing. I loved the dappled light and the plant life growing up around her. She's a very energetic, wonderful woman, and I thought the scene really reflected her energy. This painting shows musician Will Lucky playing his mandolin. When I asked him to pose for me, I told him just to play the mandolin, try to ignore me. And to begin with, that was difficult for him to do. But after a while, he got into the music. And I thought this was marvelous because at this point, he's really concentrating on the song that he's playing. And the studio that he was in was actually quite well lit, and I really wanted this more traditional, darker surround so that it looked as if the light was shining just on him. And this is another place where that illustration background really comes in useful, because I was able to sort of manipulate the direction of the light to really focus on his hands and on that, on the frets and on the expression on his face. Posthumous paintings can be a challenge because often the reference material is not that easy to work from. I knew Jamie Weissman and unfortunately wasn't able to paint him when he was living. This was painted shortly after his death. I did have a few photos of reference that I could use and of my own memories of him. And I did know that Perception, his boat, was really a part of his life, a large part of his life, as was his career in architecture. So I tried to incorporate references to both. I have his signature, James Weissman, architect, and also his boat in the background. This is a portrait that I painted of Captain Joseph Belaine, who was a whaling captain. And I had painted this for author Skip Finlay, who was writing a book on whaling captains of color. So this painting is now hanging in the library of the Martha's Vineyard Museum. I was very lucky to have as reference for this painting a tintype from the museum. It was small and in black and white, but it gave me some clues as to how the captain's face and clothing looked, and then I created the background to put him in. I also used photos of local men who had a similar lineage to the captain to get the skin tones right. Now, this is an interesting fact about historic portrait painting. Often we have no reference or not even a written description of what someone looks like. Sometimes an artist will have to hire a model they think resembles the individual based on distant descendants or ancestors' pictures and put them in clothing of the time and work from that. I was really lucky to have some good reference for this particular painting. Another type of portrait is a more casual one. And here's my friend Tara and her dog Lloyd on Lambert's Cove Beach. And I like this because it's a very relaxed type of portrait. And it's sketchy, but anyone who knows Tara and knew her dog Lloyd would know that this was them. A few years ago, I did a show called Artists in Art. I wanted to actually highlight Martha's Vineyard artists and also their work by painting these acrylic paintings of them. And then I did a one-day, well, we all did a one-day show where they brought their art in and I spoke about each artist one at a time and unveiled their portrait, one every 15 minutes for 6 hours. It was quite an ordeal. Here's Deborah Coulter, who is a abstract artist I really like on the island. I mean, I like her as a person and I like her artwork. So this was a lot of fun. I worked on this series. I tried to make the back very loose. I was working in acrylic, and I was also working with household brushes and not the typical tools I use. I just wanted to see what would happen. And here's another one of the paintings from that series. Jack Ewan is another local artist. And I'm always encouraging the artists who come to me for classes to try new things. So this was me doing that in a big way. And here's another one of local artist Traeger di Pietro. His work is really wonderful and employs some of the colors you see here in this painting. And a little side sort of creative project he does is he finds interesting shapes and shadows or stains on the ground or marks or whatever, and makes other photos and little videos with artwork around those shapes. So I thought it'd be fun to sort of capture him finding one of those shapes. And here's a last example from that same show. Marie-Louise Ruff, who is a abstract painter herself and really energetic. You can see her holding her canvas here as she applies paint. And this was so much fun to do both the show highlighting these artists and also paint in a slightly different manner. I really learned a lot from going through this process. Now, when I do something, a portrait for an institution, for example, or school, often these paintings are going to hang in a boardroom. And so, and often the people in the paintings don't actually want to be painted. So there are lots of challenges. In this particular case, this is the dean of a veterinary school who was retiring, and she had to have a portrait. There was not going to be any discussion about that. She wasn't particularly happy, but she was a sport. So we met and went around the campus and had to look at various different places that would make a good setting. She very much wanted to have a painting that was about her time teaching. And the boardroom atmosphere really called for something a little bit more traditional. So I did 2 color studies just to see what would happen. And they ended up going with the more traditional version, but I did try to make the background a lot looser than I might normally have done. She really actually liked those artists and art paintings and would have preferred something like that, I think, if she'd had the choice. But I was very happy with how this turned out because it captured her personality and her sense of style and knowledge. And also one of the buildings in the background represents a particular donor had helped the school out quite a bit, and that building was named for her. And so that was a nice tribute to be able to include in the portrait. A different kind of formal painting was this one that I did for a retired CEO of a US luxury jewelry company. And I had been hired because the archivist had seen some of the work on my website, including that one of Cynthia Riggs with a very organic background. And because the CEO had a lot of environmental interests, she thought something like that would be really cool. Now, the boardroom was one of those wooden boardrooms with gorgeous cherry mahogany wood. The paintings of 150 years worth of CEOs and founders, very, very dark and austere, wonderful paintings. But I wanted to figure out how I could do what the archivist would like and also have it work in with the boardroom and, of course, make the CEO happy. So I did two different possible versions, one showing the office setting and one with a slightly more imaginative background. When I sent those off, it was obvious that the imaginative background appealed to the board members, but they wanted to see a little bit more what my plan was, which I can understand. So I did a slightly larger study with a little bit more detail showing where I was going with all of this. This particular company makes beautiful designs in precious gemstones and diamonds. They do a special series every year and put a book out. In this particular case, over a past number of years, they had done pieces that involved underwater birds, hummingbirds, all of that sort of thing. And I thought a really nice shout out to this fellow's environmental background would be to incorporate some of those pieces of jewelry in a imaginative backing. So from that, I started working in the studio. I did his actual portrait, got most of that done using that color study as reference. And then I started working in the background because I wanted to make sure that I had everything about him sort of settled, but not completed, so that I could pull in the background and then tie the whole thing together. And here you see the finished piece. So I purposefully wanted to make sure that when you stood back from the painting, you couldn't really see what was going on. I wanted the focus to be on him and his wonderful expression. He was a very kind fellow and a really good listener and very patient with me taking time out of his extremely busy day in order to get this done. And here's a bit of a detail in the background. You can see some of the birds, seahorses, starfish, octopus, birds on the branch, all sorts of things in the background. I think I included 12 or 13 pieces all in all. And his really kind expression, which was the most important thing to capture. Of course, you can't have a painting like that without putting it in a fancy frame. So this was actually a custom 24 karat gold gilded frame that was made specifically for this piece. And lastly, we have this portrait, which I painted recently of a young man in Boston. He wanted something with a little bit of gravitas, not too casual of a look. And I really liked this simple silhouette against the Boston skyline. And I wish him all the best in his career to come. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate you being here in the studio as we talked about portraits. If you have any questions about portraits or anything to do with painting, feel free to email me at erwhelan, W-H-E-L-A-N, @gmail.com. And likewise, I've got more examples of my artwork and much more information on my website, which is elizabethwhelan.com. I look forward to hearing from you, and thank you.